Be them cards that get you advantage every turn or powerful floodgates, continuous spells can often swing the fate of a game if they stick around. However, that is not the case for all of them, of course. And in this video, we're going to be going over the worst of their kind to ever be printed. And at number 10, we have the Jam Breeding Machine. This continuous spell activates during each of your standby phases and special summons a level 1 Aqua Slime token with 500 attack and defense and attack position to your side of the field. And while this card is face up on the field, you cannot summon monsters except slime tokens. Like with most cards referencing something that happened in the anime, this is a total disappointment. You can't even use it for its intended purpose in the show, getting tributes for the Egyptian gods, because it locks you out of summoning while it sticks around, and none of the gods can be tribute set. Granted, a card that just gives you advantage for free every standby phase would be pretty broken at the time. Sinister Serpent even got banned for just returning to your hand every turn. Treeborn Frog is essentially a good version of Jam Breeding Machine, being a free body every standby phase, and it doesn't stop you from tributing it away. Treeborn ended up seeing a lot of play, and even ended up on the Forbidden Limited list for a while. However, Jam Breeding Machine obviously did not have that much luck, as there aren't that many good uses for it. It's not useful for protecting your life points since the tokens must be special summoned in attack position with their paltry 500 stats. Now, the card doesn't stop you from playing entirely since you can still set monsters, so you could play with flip monsters. Still, since you can't flip them yourself, you're going to be relying on your opponent to attack into them and do that for you. While you can still use these tokens for cards that tribute them for cost, like Spiritual Water Art Aoi or Enemy Controller, it's gonna be very hard to capitalize off of any advantage when you can't bring actual good monsters out. This might be a terrible card, but it at least does something, and that alone makes it one of the least worst on this list. And at number 9, we have the Spirit Messages. These are continuous spells portraying the letters I in A and L, and their sole effect is that they must be placed on the field by the effective Destiny board. This being a continuous trap that sticks around on the field and places a spirit message from your hand or deck into the board during each end phase. Then, when you assemble all 5, you win the duel. Carrying on with the anime that translated badly, where you got these 4 terrible bricks. The biggest issue with the Destiny board win con is that it takes a lot of turns for it to fully resolve, and your opponent has to not interact with you in any way. At which point, you probably could have just beaten them to death in less time. The worst part is that since Destiny board blows away all the other pieces of the puzzle if any of them leave the field by any means, you're always one MST away from being sent back to square one. On top of that, since Destiny board only places from hand or deck, not the graveyard, you're not going to be able to go for it again in the same duel. There's also the issue that you would need to stop your opponent from killing you on these turns, and the easiest way of doing that would be with floodgates, most of which are continuous spells and traps. You need to have your 5 spell and trap card zones filled in with final for Destiny board to win you the game, meaning that these same floodgates that would keep you alive also prevent you from winning entirely, as the card won't be able to activate and place the last piece. There's a reason why Exodia has always been the best you win the duel card. Interacting with the hand is much harder than with the field, and being able to play heavy search and draw power to speed up your win sure beats having to wait around for it instead. But hey, even if winning with Destiny board might be the one thing harder than winning with Jam Breeding Machine slime tokens, being able to win with it at all already helps it a step above most other cards on this list. And at number 8, we have Card Shuffle. As you can probably tell, this card lets you shuffle either player's deck once per turn by paying 300 life points. Well, this is the closest you can get to a card doing literally nothing before you get into Toon World territory. However, even that card managed to at least see some play since it was searchable to a table of contents and got your life points down for Reversal Quiz OTK. On the other hand, you need to look pretty hard to find good applications for Card Shuffle, with most of them being slightly beneficial at best. Getting fate sealed by cards that mess with your top deck like Ryza and Phoenix Wing Windblast has got to be one of the most devastating things that can happen to you in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! So if you look at it, no matter how bad Card Shuffle might seem, it is a way to get rid of that sort of luck. However, needless to say, that's never going to be the best way to go about it. In fact, playing this card will probably make your matchup with these kinds of cards even worse, since it's a perfect target for them to stack on top of your deck. Either way, you're much rather to get out of the situation by playing cards that modify your deck instead, like a Sangan Searching or a Card Trooper Milling. When looking at a way to use this card against your opponent, well, you're going to need to look at their top deck at any time for this to be of any use. Convulsion of Nature instantly comes to mind, but at that point you're looking at a 2-card combo to maybe make your opponent draw a blank. You wouldn't have to worry so much about your opponent's top deck if you had access to 2 useful cards instead of this awful combo. Not to mention that if you want to pair Convulsion with another continuous spell, you might as well go with Archfiend's Oath, which will give you an extra draw every turn per copy instead. To this day, Card Shuffle and Tainted Wisdom are the only cards whose only effect is to shuffle a deck, and hopefully it stays that way for well in the foreseeable future. And at number 7, we have Spiritual Energy Settle Machine. As long as this card is face up on the field, all spirit monsters don't have to return themselves to the hand with their effects during the end phase. However, you must discard one card during each of your end phases or the card destroys itself. And last, if this card is removed from the field, all spirit monsters return to their owner's hand. So, just for a little bit of context, spirits are a type of monster that usually can't be special summoned and return to the hand during the end phase of a turn in which they're normal summoned or flip face up. This card lets you get around that last caveat of them. So, sounds pretty good for a spirit deck, right? Well, not really. Most of the playable spirit monsters are already made with that design in mind. Tsukiyomi flips a monster face down, and Dark Dust Spirit destroys all other face-up monsters with normal summoned, and so were played as a reusable utility that would all dodge spell speed 1 removal. Even the then feared Yatagarasu benefited more from coming back to the hand at the end of the turn, so your opponent wouldn't be able to beat over it with its tiny body. All the spirits you'd want to keep around the field were either incredibly unreasonable to bring out, like the 2 tributes, or came out so much later on in the game's history that by then there were better ways to make them stick around. On the other hand, since this card does affect both players, you could get the idea of playing as a counter for that instead, except that spirit decks were never really a thing. Most of them were only splashed into regular decks as techs, because their effects were never that cohesive. The one deck that called itself Spirits came out much later on, and only used them as a rank 4 engine with Sakitama and Aratama. Yosenju was a whole archetype that was meant to be a modern take on Spirits, but since they lacked the actual subtype, they were completely unaffected by this card. The cherry on top of all this is that they thought this card was strong enough to require a maintenance cost of a discard per turn, making you go minus every turn to maybe slightly inconvenience your opponent in the best of cases. And at number 6, we have Samsara. This spell makes it so the monsters tributed for ritual summon are returned to their owner's deck instead of being sent to the graveyard. Continue on with the trend with cards that are so bad you can't even tell whether they're support or anti-support. We've got this. So on one hand, you could be teching Samsara to reuse monsters you tributed for a ritual summon by shuffling them back. However, a card that provides no value up front and only helps you when you're already doing what you're supposed to be doing makes no sense to run. Not to mention that if putting monsters back in your deck was any important to your strategy, you could be doing so while also going plus by just playing Pot of Avarice. When you're looking at this card from the other angle, as an anti-ritual floodgate, it still makes no sense to play it. Even the first real ritual deck, Demise OTK, did not care much about the tributes actually hitting the graveyard anyways. More importantly, the main ritual spell they used, Advanced Ritual Art, did not even tribute monsters, but rather just sent vanillas from the deck to the graveyard instead, which bypasses Samsara entirely. That's sort of the theme with most ritual decks that have been relevant actually. The mechanic is so inherently bad that most decks cheat it to some degree, and so just ignore this card entirely. You had the Necrons, which could ritual summon by banishing from the graveyard or dumping cards from the extra deck to the graveyard, and Drytrons, which could ritual summon by detaching materials from an Xyz monster. Sure, Samsara could potentially be annoying for a modern deck in Voiceless because they actually tribute for their summons and like having cards like Low hitting the graveyard. But if you're looking at it this way, there's several other cards that demolish ritual strategies rather than slightly hindering them. Dimensional Barrier straight up stops ritual summoning for a whole turn, which is all you really need to win nowadays. Even if you want something that lasts forever, Mask of Restricts predates Samsara by years and stops your opponent from tributing anything in any situation. So whether you play rituals or go up against them, there's no reason to have Samsara in your deck. And at number 5, we have Impenetrable Formation. This continuous spell requires you to choose a monster on your side of the field when activated. And then, while you control 2 or more monsters, and they're all in defense position, the chosen monster gains 700 defense. Also, if that monster leaves the field, destroy this card. It just makes no sense why Konami would make a card that's just an equip spell with extra steps, and yet here we are. This card's mechanics are almost exactly the same as one, except you need extra monsters on the field, have everything in certain battle positions, and to keep them like that to get this card's boost off. Without even getting to the fact that equip spells are just naturally easier to search, they also often give you better effects for less of a hassle. Horn of the Unicorn came out several years before this card, and it just gives the monster a 700 boost to both attack and defense. And even that got power crept rather quickly by United We Stand, which gives the monster 800 in both stats for each face-up monster you control, meaning that in the same conditions as Impenetrable Formation, you're getting an extra 900 defense. This card is heavily outclassed even just ignoring these 2 couple of cards that also give you an attack boost that lets you beat over stuff. The only thing that Impenetrable Formation might have going for it is that it won't destroy itself by game mechanics if the monster is flipped face down. which is actually a pretty big downside that equips have. With that said, if you have a monster that's gaining defense out of the field, odds are your opponent is not going to be spending their Book of Moon to flip it face down, making it almost meaningless. Even if this card gave you a flat 700 defense boost to every one of your monsters, it would still see no play, as there's always more value in being proactive than anything else. Slamming down monsters with Solidarity was once a viable win con, but Turtlet with this fantasy version of Impenetrable Formation never would. Of course, if Sanctuary begins looking more like a real card when it's next to you, you know things couldn't be any worse. And at number 4, we have the Second and Third Sarcophagi. These are two continuous spells whose only text restricts them to only being able to place on the field by the effect of the first sarcophagus, a continuous trap that puts them from your hand or deck on the field during your opponent's end phase. When you assemble all 3 of them, you send them all to the graveyard and then special summon a Spirit of the Pharaoh from your hand or deck. Your big payoff for all of this is a level 6 light zombie with 2500 attack that can reborn up to 4 level 2 or lower normal zombie monsters from your graveyard. As you can probably tell, these cards share a lot with the Spirit Message cards from earlier. You get a clock that's 2 turns shorter since there's only 3 pieces instead of 5, but your payoff goes from winning on the spot to bringing out a 3500 attack beater. The Pharaoh's effect is almost completely irrelevant. The best low level normal monster you can get off of this is Clown Zombie, a 1350 beater, meaning that even if you could somehow have 4 copies of it in your deck and revive all of them with the Spirit of the Pharaoh to attack your opponent on an empty board, it still would not be enough damage for an OTK. Besides, putting 3 vanillas into the graveyard is actually pretty hard, even more so back in the day. You'd probably have to be running a heavy meal package with Raikos and Lilas and the like. Except that you can't because, just like with Destiny board, if any of the sarcophagi or the spirit hit the graveyard at any time, the rest of the cards all become useless. At least the Destiny board eventually makes your opponent interact with it because it does win you the game. But you can just let the first sarcophagus fully resolve with little to no consequences. Odds are they haven't got the setup needed for Pharaoh to be any good. And even if they do, it's just a bunch of beaters. A single Mirror Force and it's all gone. It's fitting that the meta with these cards is to bring out the clowns because you'd have to be one in order to be running this nonsense. And at number 3, we have Senri Eye. This spell allows you to, once during each of your standby phases, pay 100 life points to look at the top card of your opponent's deck, and then put it back. There's definitely some value in knowing your opponent's top deck. One of the most infuriating things about playing against Spiral was that they'd always make you draw the worst out of your top 3 cards. And this same was true when going up against stun decks using Goddess Skuld's Oracle to hide your spell and trap removal every turn. Of course, there's a pretty big rift between Senri and these 2 techs that have actually seen meta play. The first being that you don't get to do anything about your opponent's top deck. Senri Eye also does nothing the turn you put it down on the field. It needs to stick through a whole opponent's turn and still be on your side of the field during the standby phase for it to get its effect off. Then you can see if your opponent is going to top deck the perfect answer to your board, but there's still nothing that you can do about it. Well, unless you want to combo this card with another all-star from our list earlier, Card Shuffle. The point is that just knowing what your opponent will draw is almost completely useless if you can't interact with it. Instead of this, you could have had an actual answer to whatever will make you lose the game at the time. It's not even 100% sure to give you the proper info, since it only looks during the standby phase, meaning that if you hit into a recruiter in the battle phase, for example, your opponent's deck will get shuffled, and you'll be in the dark again. Imagine going through all the trouble to unlock the third eye, only for it to be as useless as this card. And at number 2, we have Shifting Shadows. This continuous spell lets you, once per turn, pay 300 life points to rearrange your face-down monsters on the field. So the idea with this card is that even if your monsters are set, your opponent can still know some information about them. Like, what if they were brought out by a card that specials a monster face down, or they got the monster flipped at some point, or maybe the monster has been set on the field for a couple of turns now and your opponent has figured out they shouldn't attack into it. If any of these apply and you've got multiple monsters set out, you can use Shifting Shadows to hide them again. The issue is that this is extremely convoluted. Requires you to multiple monsters out in this card, all for a very marginal information advantage that may not even work. Even if you rearrange your sets when there's a monster you want your opponent to hit into, and when you don't, there's a 50% chance your opponent will guess right anyways. And yeah, you can increase your odds if you have many more monsters than your opponent does, but odds are you aren't winning on board if one of your cards was Shifting Shadows instead of a more useful one. Even the monster version of this card, Wandering Mummy, puts it to shame because it at least can be used as a 1500 beater. If you really want to protect your set monsters, there are many other cards to prevent them from being dealt with in battle or outside of it, with no guesswork involved. Even a pure flip deck would have trouble justifying a slot for this anywhere on their list. And finally, at number 1, we've got Blessings of the Nile. While this card is face up on the field, each time a card is discarded from your hand to the graveyard by an opponent's card effect, you gain 1,000 life points. There's nothing worse than getting your hand ripped in Yu-Gi-Oh! So a card that helps you make up for it sounds like a good idea, right? Well, you're not going to be doing so by just gaining 1,000 life points. Even if you have a handful of bricks, a card in your hand is worth much, much more than that. The thousands of life points you'd get by getting your hand ripped apart by Delinquent Duo or repeated Gothams activations are not going to do anything to win you the duel. They might just delay the inevitable at best. Having this face up is not going to deter anyone from doing that. And even if you are playing some sort of life point gain stall strategy, there are better cards for that. Solemn Wishes is another awful card, but it just gains you 500 life points each turn whenever you draw a card, which is something that's going to happen way more often during a duel than getting cards discarded from your hand by your opponent. If you really wanted to counter an opponent trying to win with hand destruction, you have Gemini Imps, a hand trap made specifically for that, and Dark Worlds, an entire archetype built to plus off that. The latter of which actually saw quite a bit of play for that reason in formats where people were just spamming Spirit Reapers or Airbellums. Blessing of the Nile is also extremely narrow in which kind of hand disruptions it triggers, even with its minuscule payoff. Take something like Forceful Sentry. It'll get rid of a card in your hand without giving you anything in return, since it gets shuffled back. Spiritual Waterheart Aoi's wording sends the card to the graveyard instead of discarding it, meaning no 1,000 life points for you as well. The same applies to Trishula and Omega, since they're banishing it. So we're looking at a card that doesn't do what it's supposed to do, and doesn't even work when it's supposed to. As bad as they were, some of the other stinkers on this list were at least semi-useful during very specific niche situations. But when it comes to this one, well, the only blessing is the one your opponent is getting from you having this in your deck. Alright, and that's the list. If you happen to know of any other cards you might have missed, or any ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments below.